Hello and welcome. My name is Allison Calvert and I'm a faculty support and classroom consultant here at Ashford University. I will be the host of this session, Public Memory in the Digital Realm. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but I encourage you to post comments in the chat. Also, keep your eye on the chat for a link to a helpful session feedback survey. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you Eliza Lafferty, honors thesis student at Georgetown University.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm very grateful for your introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to be here and stepping away from electoral politics for a moment and just focusing on teaching and learning. So as Allison said, my name is Eliza Lafferty. I am a senior at Georgetown University, soon to graduate in December, and I'm very grateful to be here with you speaking about reimagining public memory in the digital realm. We'll be asking questions about teaching systems of memory, how it is recorded, remembered, and transferred, and inspiring actions and policy in the present. So I have three main goals for our conversation that I will address at the end and will bring up a number of times, but they are, first, to embrace the digital model. Second, to encourage new classroom materials. And third, to empower and engage students. So if we'll go to our next slide, please. I'd love to give you an overview of our conversation today. So to start, I will be sharing a land acknowledgement, and then I will go into personal background, a little bit more about me, and then we will together identify the issue and our intervention. Then I will introduce a case study and then take that case study and apply it to our goals of embracing, encouraging, and empowering students. And at the end, I will share some resources for moving forward and connecting afterward. I also want to note, I really would love to hear your questions. I welcome them and I'm grateful for them. But I'll also ask that you please write them down, remember them, and then share them with me at the end, either through the chat or live. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And so to start, I want to acknowledge that I am, if we'll go to the next slide, please. I'm speaking on the Kumeyaay land right now. And I think that is essential to our conversation because I will be bringing up a case study about immigration. And I recognize that when I talk about immigration, my ancestors, the immigrants that I speak about, did not immigrate onto neutral land. And so throughout this presentation and at the end, I hope I will provide you with a number of resources that will allow us to address our goals and keep in mind the Indigenous populations that we are affecting and also teaching justice for Native communities. And that is one of the cornerstones, I think, to this presentation that we'll be returning to. So I first want to acknowledge that. And I'll now move on to the next slide, please. A little bit more about who I am. So I've included a number of photographs here. So as I said, I am a senior at Georgetown University. I will have a bachelor's of arts in government and a bachelor's of arts in art history and a minor in history. And I bring this up because these are my two main areas of study and guiding principles as I have moved through my academic, professional, community work. And so I have an image on the left of Georgetown University, beautiful school. And then also on the right, I've included three images of places that are important to me or have somehow shaped my interest in this intersection between politics, government, and art history. So the first is an image of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and I interned there in the spring of 2019 and was very grateful to be learning about the intersection between public art, museum spaces, and representation in galleries. And then the next photo is an image of Mount Vernon, where I was a leadership fellow in the summer of 2019, and where I really had an eye for a project based on the intersection between politics and art. So that also developed there. And the last image is an image of Capitol Hill. And I also interned for my senator after my freshman year of college. And that really inspired a mindset for me about policy and advocacy. And a little bit more about how I'll be taking all of this and transferring it. I will be attending law school in the fall, and I intend to practice art law and or cultural property law. And so these two areas, art history, government policy, really shape the way that I view the world. And I bring that up because, as you'll see in my next slide, please, my presentation aims to connect history, art history, to policy. So what I'll posit to you, my main claim, my main thesis, is that there's a systemic and direct relationship between the way that we understand and learn and the way that that manifests itself in our understandings of power and structures of power. And so I have these two sides of the screen divided, right? On the left side, we'll see seeing, learning, and understanding. And I posit to you that the way that we see, learn, understand directly translates to what is visible in history, artifacts, images, and art. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see representation, influence, and power. And I'll say that there's a direct correlation between what we are seeing, the images we are seeing, the art we are seeing, and the way that that inspires representation, influence, power, as it is visible in politics and policy. And so I think this connection, this key connection between history, art history, and policy is something that really is the cornerstone to my presentation today. And so I'm going to now bring up a case study that is guided by this question of how can we influence the way that we are seeing, learning, and understanding? How can we influence that? And so my suggestion is that we can influence this by providing a platform for new images for the public to see. And so I introduced to you our case study for today, the Pakinggan Archive, which is the study of my senior thesis in art history, my honors thesis at Georgetown. So I've personally developed this archive and curated it to meet this need. And I want to explain a little bit more about what that archive is. On the next slide, you'll see images of the Pakinggan Archive. Yes, exactly. So on the left, you'll see our big banner, and that's the main page. And Pakinggan means listen in Tagalog. It's a command for us to be listening. I think that's really cornerstone to this as well. And what the archive is a digital archive of Filipinx Americans and their immigration paths from the Philippine Islands to the United States, specifically in Southern California. And so what it tangibly is a collection of vernacular, i.e. homemade, everyday images that shows people as they would like to be seen. And this is very powerful. And so it's categorized on the right side of the screen. You'll see it's categorized by families, right? So we see the Villalpando family, the Reyes, Alegado families. And among those families, there are also cross-curated common themes. And so that goes around the lines of service in the US Navy and Air Force, education, motherhood, fatherhood, religion, and the church, etc. And so I present this to you, and I developed this because, as you'll see on the next slide, please, I recognized a gap in public amnesia. And I'm positing to you that there's public amnesia around what we are seeing, learning, and understanding regarding Filipinx Americans. And so I want to share that this is very important. This gap is significant because there's a direct relationship, as I said a couple of slides ago, there's a direct relationship between the way that we see things and the way that that impacts representation, influence, and power. And it's manifested in policy and politics. And so I turned to a couple data points. First, Filipinos are the second largest Asian American population in the United States. That is 4 million people. At the same time, our education systems, our public education systems, rarely discuss Filipino history in any textbook. If they are discussed, it's usually in the context of the Philippine-American War, which is still framed through the mindset of the white Americans that were invading the Philippines at that time. Also, if we look to politics purely by statistics, right, we can see that there's currently only one Filipino representative in Congress, 4 million people, and only one representative in Congress. I'll also share that something very near to us right now, COVID-19, the pandemic, has disproportionately impacted Filipinos. There's a 40% mortality rate compared to the national 3.7% in the United States. So that is significant. I want to share this because I think this part of the cause, part of what operates in the system is public amnesia, the lack of knowledge around Filipino Americans in the United States. And so I have 3 images on the slide before you. On the far left, you'll see a screenshot of the National Archives. So this is our nation's archives, right? This should have all of the information that we expect our nation to hold as what is part of their history, what is worthy of being remembered. And if we just, I know it's a little bit tiny, but if you squint your eyes and look down, what are the lines that we're seeing about this? I mean, one of the first ones, it's about World War II veterans. Okay, and then we move down, we see about like commemorations through the library, Reagan Library, and then there's something about Chinese immigration and Chinese in the United States. And so what I'm saying is that Filipinos in all of these narratives are decentered. They are not the center points. There's nothing about Filipino leadership, representation, influence, power. Instead, they are objects. They are subjects for us to be writing about, viewing, and sometimes not even directly discussing. Second image is a xenophobic sign of Filipinos in the 1920s, a sign that was put out in Northern California that is common. Many books have been written about it. Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down. So this history of xenophobia is not that far away. And also, I'll turn to a 1904 World's Fair poster where Indigenous Filipinos were put on display and viewed by the public as primitive, as exotic, as animalistic, also not that far away. And so my question is, if we turn to the next slide, please, is how do we fill this gap, this terrible gap that has influenced policy, politics for so many years? And so I see it in a very piecemeal but meaningful way. We fill this gap by turning to vernacular images, turning to images of people as they wish to be seen as scholars, contributors to society, servicemen, servicewomen, homeowners, people's property in the United States. This is important. And our digital archive, the Pakinggan Archive, provides a space for self-representation and power as it translates to agency as well. So these are a number of photos from the archive. I encourage you to visit it at the end as well. But it's just an example, just a sample size of the way that we are trying to turn this memory and the way that we are viewing Filipinx Americans in the United States. So our next slide, I'll introduce the way that this can become a workable model. So we're taking our case study and we're moving it into a generalized form that we can apply to other scenarios. So first, we're starting out the top line, public amnesia, introduce our digital model is our intervention, and then that hopefully foments, builds public memory around Filipinx Americans. Extracting that model, we'll see what I was just introducing at the beginning, that the way that we learn, see, understand, what I will posit to you, the way that we meet that is by embracing, encouraging, and empowering students. Then we'll influence how we represent, influence, and apply power structures, allocate power. And so on our next slide, please, I'll introduce once again our three main goals from this conversation. First, to embrace digital models. Second, to encourage new classroom materials. And last, to empower students. And so this is the way that we apply this case study. This is the way that we teach public memory, just one way to teach public memory through the digital realm. And so first, I'd like to introduce how we embrace the digital model. So for the last 8 or so months, possibly over that, we've relied on the digital realm to provide us with connection, to provide us with many resources that we were otherwise finding in other realms, in the physical realm, imaginative, whatnot. But this revealed to us, I think, what many of us knew, that the digital spaces are educational spaces. They're powerful platforms for resource sharing and collective action, inspiring action. And so what I encourage us to do as teachers, as learners, is to embrace the digital model and to recognize that the digital model is inherently and oftentimes public facing. We can take classroom materials and make them public. Embracing the digital model is like this forward arrow. It is a forward arrow, a call for us to move forward, engage the public, and go beyond just what's in our classroom. So a couple of project ideas, very tangible things. If you are teaching a course, I would encourage you to start a class Instagram, start a class social media page, and have a classroom takeover. Have individual students take the camera, get behind the screen, and explain what you're talking about in the classroom. Also, you could start a collective blog. You could start a collective newsletter about classroom materials. All of these are wonderful ideas to use the digital model and use it to progress what you're learning about in the classroom, and also turn it towards the outside to recognize who else can you impact. So second, I'll turn to the way that we can encourage new and non-traditional classroom materials. So our next slide, please, you'll see I've included an image of a white-walled museum so that we may remember museums are not neutral spaces. Sometimes we envision museums like this, just blank white walls that tell us history, tell us what we're supposed to know. But I would disagree with that. And I'd say that not only are museums not neutral spaces, textbooks aren't neutral spaces, journal articles we're reading aren't neutral spaces, classrooms aren't neutral spaces. And so instead, I would encourage us to turn our perspective to the sources that we've considered, that we have, to turn our perspective to sources that we've considered canonical or baseline, and to ask critical questions about them, to be critical about those sources. And so we must ask, are the traditional materials that we've based our curriculum on, are they inclusive or are they exclusive? Are they contributing to public amnesia or are they contributing to public memory? What do these sources do? Because every source does something, right? It either moves in one direction or moves against that direction. So in this process, we'll identify that non-traditional classroom materials, such as a personal archive, for example, or the social media accounts, the blogs that I was discussing, are worthy of discussion and are worthy of consideration in those classroom spaces. And so I've provided a number of classroom curriculum ideas. Possibly, first, provide a diversity of perspectives when you're reading theories or textbooks. Second, reflect on your own materials. Ask about representation, context, the ethical value of those works. Third, encourage students to reflect on these materials and learn to embrace non-traditional sources of information. And so last, this leads me to my third goal for us today, which is to empower and engage students. So given that we are turning our attention to these non-traditional classroom materials and that we're embracing the digital realm, I believe we are prepared to empower students. And we should be providing students with their own outlets to become innovators and curators in their own educations. And I believe this is especially relevant to Black, Indigenous, other peoples of color, or people with other salient identities, to provide them with agency in a coursework that is oftentimes based in a colonial, imperialistic mindset and racist mindset. I believe it's important that we're empowering students to be their own discoverers, their own curators, innovators of these spaces. And so for our tangible takeaway from this, I want to provide a personal reflection. My own experience of researching my own family's history and organizing with my community has been both a joy and it's been a privilege. I feel incentivized to do this work. I think that's key. Because I think that we can take what we've learned, take what I've learned, and translate this to recognize that we can encourage students to celebrate their heritage and their classmates' heritages in a classroom setting. That's very powerful. And it's powerful to be learning the importance of our personal narratives in educational spaces, because that encourages, once again, I'll bring us back to our final point, it encourages the way that we see policy, politics, and power. And so, finally, I'll turn to our last slide, please. And I believe that our collective energy together as we teach will be able to embrace the digital models, encourage new classroom materials, and empower students. And us working collectively, I believe, will have an impact on politics and policy moving forward. Thank you. And I'll turn to our last slide, please, where I've included my contact information. I have a website there, email, LinkedIn. I really want to be in contact with you. If you have further questions, ideas for me to consider, you can either reach out via those mechanisms, or I'd also welcome any questions you have now via the chat or live. Thank you for all your time.
I have a question. Well, first, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. I'm so glad that I was able to come see it. I know that some of the work you do and some of the things you've talked about are about art. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the relationship between art and resistance and empowerment and, personal narratives, and how art can also be related to some of the policy things that you're talking about with your work.
Megalata, thank you so much for that question. I'm very grateful to be here with you, and I appreciate that question a lot because I also think it's important to recognize that art, not just vernacular images, not just personal photographs, are definitely an intervention for us to be relating these personal narratives and explaining this. And one example I will raise, one of my favorite artists, her name is Tania Bruguera, and she's a Cuban artist. She works mostly in the UK, but she travels around. She's involved in the Immigrant International Alliance, has done wonderful work advocating for immigrant rights around the world. And one of the pieces that I would turn to answer this question is a piece that she had in the Tate Museum in London about a couple years ago, 2019, or it's 2018 and 2019 is kind of a longer exhibition. And the way that it worked was it was a big hall, right? And there was this heat sensitive paint that was applied to the floor of the entire space. And beneath the heat sensitive paint, there was an image of a Syrian refugee named Yusuf. And in order for people to see this image, in order for people to make this image visible, they had to physically apply their own body heat in order to see the image. And so what's important here is that the entire image of the refugee could only be seen if the whole hall were filled with people pressing their hands against the floor and being able to step back and reveal the image all at once. And so I think this is significant because it is an intervention that recognizes that there is a certain collective action to viewing and a collective narrative that is required in order for us to unlock narratives that are oftentimes unseen and invisible. But I think the work of Tania Bruguera is essential here because she is providing us that physical space to actually engage those questions. And so I think that art can be that tool to both engage people, bring them together, and also inspire us to take collective action in favor of human rights, refugee rights, immigrant rights. So thank you for that question. If there aren't any further questions, I would just once again love to share my contact information with you. If you have questions after this, I would love to engage them with you. I'm very grateful for all your time. I know it's a busy time of year and everything, and there's so much going on in our world. And so I appreciate you taking aside this time, space, energy to share this with me and to think critically about the way that we are viewing images and then applying that to policy. So thank you.